This is the Chapter 5, Part 1 review video. Our first problem is asking us to determine which of the binomials is not a factor of this given polynomial. Now, we talked about in class how you can use synthetic division to determine whether a binomial is a factor of a polynomial. And you do that by looking at the remainder. So we know if our remainder is 0, then you do have a factor, because that means it divides in evenly, there's nothing left over. But if your remainder is not equal to 0, then you do not have a factor. So what we need to do here is it's asking us to find out which one is not a factor. We have to go through and do synthetic with each of these problems to figure out which one will have a remainder that is not equal to 0. So I'm going to start with my synthetic. I'm going to bring down the coefficients of our polynomial here. So I have 4, negative 21, negative 46, 219, and 180. So I'm going to write all of those down here. 4, negative 21, negative 46, 219, and 180. And I'm going to start with the first one here. I'm going to start with x plus 4. So if I'm checking to see whether x plus 4 is a factor, I'm going to write minus 4, negative 4 into that box. And I'm going to begin my synthetic division. So my 4 comes down. And now I'm going to take 4 times negative 4, which gets me negative 16. Now I take 21 and the 16, and since they're both negative, I add them together and I get negative 37. Then I take that, I multiply that times my 4, which gets me 148. I'm going to take negative 46 plus 148, which gets me 102. Again, that 102 gets multiplied by my negative 4, which gives me negative 408. I add down my rows, so 219 plus a negative 408. Sorry, I'm trying to punch this into my calculator. 408. Negative 189. I multiply that times negative 4. And I get 756. And then if I add that to my 180, I get 936. So my remainder is 936. So this means that x plus 4 is not a factor. And then you could go back and you could check each of these other B, C, and D options, and your remainders will be 0 for all of those because those are 3 factors. X plus 4 is the only one that is not a factor, and we know that because of this remainder here. So here I'm looking at end behavior, and I want to just remind you how end behavior works. You're going to be looking at 2 things. You look at the lead coefficient first, and if the lead coefficient is negative, negative people bring you right down. If your lead coefficient is positive, positive people bring you right up. After you've determined what your right side does, then you're going to look at the degree. For your degree, you have 2 options. You have an odd degree or you have an even degree. An odd degree means that you're going to have the opposite of the right side. Your even degree means you'll have the same as your right side. So let's look at 2 different examples here. We've got number 2 and number 3. In number 2, my lead coefficient is 3. It's a positive 3, so that tells me right up. Then I look at my degree. My degree is 6, which is an even number, 2, 4, 6, 8. So because that's even, I know that my left side also has to go up. So right up, left up is your end behavior for number 2. Now I do want to point out something specific. These examples are all in standard form because their exponents go 6, 5, 4. They're going down, high to low. Same with number 3, 5, 4, 3. My exponents are going down. You have to be careful when you're doing these problems. If everything's kind of jumbled up, your lead coefficient and your degree are not necessarily the very first thing you see. They may be hidden later in that polynomial, so please be careful for that. All right, so the last one here, I've got my lead coefficient is -3, which means write down, and my degree is 5, which is an odd number, so I need to do the opposite from my right, which means my left side has to go up. Okay, so here what they've done is they've given us 3 zeros, and what we need to do is we need to go backwards and try to find what our polynomial was. So I'm going to take those 3 zeros and I'm going to plug them into 3 sets of parentheses with my variable x. If I have the number -1 here, I need to put +1. If I have a +1, I need to put -1. And if I have a +2, I need to put -2. So I basically just undid this whole solving idea. I plugged them back into the parentheses. Now, we're always going to do double distribution twice here, but I want to start with these two because I know something's going to cancel, seeing as they're the same thing, just with opposite signs. So I'm going to go ahead and double distribute. X times x is x squared minus 1x plus 1x minus 1. And you see this cancels. Those are gone. And I'm left with just x squared minus 1. But I still have this x minus 2 that was in the original problem that I haven't taken into consideration yet. So I have to double distribute again. So my x squared to my x, and to my 2, my 1 to my x, and my 1 to my 2. All right, that's my answer. It's already ordered high to low, and I can't have anything combined. I don't have any like terms, so this is my final answer. All right, so in this problem, I'm looking for my zeros and their multiplicities. And I have this given polynomial. The first thing I have to do is I have to take that thing and I have to break it up into its factors so I can actually see what x equals. And when I'm factoring, we should remember that the very first thing we always do is look for a GCF. And I see within this, I've got 4x's here, 3x's here, and 2x's here. I can pull out an entire x squared to the front of my problem. Then I'm left with x squared plus 2x minus 8. Now that I have this thing here, I'm going to factor that using like the beats. So I have x squared, got my 2 parentheses, x and x. I need factors of -8 that will add to 2. So factors of -8 that will add to 2. The numbers I get there are +4 and -2. So now I have my answer in factored form, but I need to determine what my zeros are. So these ones are easy. X equals 2, because remember you take it, you flip the sign. X equals -4. Here, my x squared, that tells me x equals 0, because I'm setting these things equal to 0, so x must equal 0. And that squared there tells me that I have a multiplicity of 2. The other answers are just multiplicity of 1 because they only appear one time. But this x value for this x equals 0 appears twice. So it has a multiplicity of 2. Okay, so now I'm looking at the graph of this polynomial. They give me a cubic polynomial, and what I need to do first is I need to find my zeros. So again, I'm looking for my GCF that I can factor out, and I see I can factor out an x, leaving me with x squared minus x minus 6. I'm going to break it up into the beats. I have, let's see, I need factors of -6 that will add to -1. So I know there I need to be using a -3 and a +2, which tells me my zeros are 0, 3, and -2. So I'm going to plot those points on this graph. 0, 3, and -2. So I've got my zeros. The next thing I have to do is I have to determine my end behavior. So I'm going to look back at my original polynomial. And remember, we talked about this in problems 2 and 3. I need to identify my lead coefficient and my degree. My lead coefficient is 1. That's positive, so I need to go right up. My degree is 3, which is odd, which means opposite, so I need to go left down. So from my furthest right point, which is this one right here, I'm just going to draw a line up. And from my furthest left point, I'm going to draw a line down. Now I have to be able to connect those two arrows somehow. Because all of my multiplicities are 1, that means I'm going to go through all of my points. I'm not going to do any bouncing. So I'm just going to kind of go through all of my points and create this little squiggly connection between my arrows. So this part in the middle here that I just did is not the most important thing in the entire world. It's really important that you know where your zeros are and that you know your end behavior. All right, this problem just asks us to classify by degree. So I'm going to find my highest exponent, which is this one right here. So my highest exponent is 4, which means I have a quartic polynomial. Remember, it's a degree of 1 is linear, degree of 2 is quadratic, degree of 3 cubic, 4 quartic, and 5 quintic. So here they're asking me to identify the degree. Now, it's very, very common for people to just look at the first term and say, oh, my degree is 1. But you don't want to do that. You want to look through your entire problem and see where you have your highest exponent. So if I do that, I see my highest exponent is 5, so my degree relates to that highest exponent, which is 5. And if they asked you for the vocab word, that would be quintic. Okay, so here we need to solve by factoring. First of all, though, I see that this is equal to -64 instead of equal to 0. So our very first step is to add that 64 to both sides so that we have the right form. So now I have x to the 4th minus 20x squared plus 64 equals 0. And now I'm ready to go, setting up my parentheses here. Now, we talked about this in class. I have an x to the 4th here, which we haven't really seen all that much. We did it for, a couple days in class, but we hadn't seen it before that when we were factoring. But it's really not a big deal. All you're going to do is you're going to take that x to the 4th and you're going to split it up into x squared and x squared. Then it becomes just a typical problem. So I need factors of 64 that will add to a -20. What I get is -4 and -16. So now I have those equal to 0. And what I have to do is I have to go through and I have to solve each of these. So I'm going to take each of them and set them equal to 0. In the first one, I'm going to move my 4 over to the right side. I get x squared equals 4. Now to undo that square, I need to take the square root of both sides, which leaves me with x equals plus or minus 2. And don't forget about the plus or minus part. That's really important. Now we move on to the second one. I'm going to move my 16 to the right, which gives me x squared equals 16. Again, I'm going to go through here. I'm going to take my square root, which gives me x equals plus or minus 4. So these answers here, those are your 4 answers. And remember, if you have a degree of 4, then you need to have 4 answers. So please be careful when you're doing that. All right, we got another factoring problem. So again, my 2/16's on the wrong side. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move that very first thing. So my problem is x cubed minus 2/16 equals 0. And I see that I have a 3 here, which leads me to think roller coaster. As soon as I know that I'm dealing with cubed values, you should be thinking of roller coaster. All right, so I'm going to figure out who's going to go on our roller coaster ride. I've got x and x and x, and then 2/16 is 6 times 6 times 6. So I know who's going on the roller coaster. I set up the small cart in front and the big cart in back. One of my x's gets to go in the front with one of my 6's, but the other 2 x's go in back. The other 2 6's go in back. Now everybody's buckled up. We're ready to go on the roller coaster ride, which ends up going through a loop-to-loop. I get 6x in the middle here, and then after we get off the ride, we have to determine whether people screamed, same, so minus, or opposite, so plus, puked, positive. So my answer is x minus 6, x squared plus 6x plus 36. Now, at this point, I take my x minus 6 and I solve it and say, okay, well then x equals 6 is one of my solutions, one of my zeros. But for this part here, I have to use the quadratic formula. So let's get that written down. I have x equals opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I'm going to plug in opposite of b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Negative 6 plus or minus square root of negative 108 all over 2. I need to take 108 and I need to see if that can be simplified. Oh, but look, it's negative. So I need to first take out an I. And if I ask my calculator, sorry, I need a little bit more space here. If I ask my calculator whether 108 reduces, it will spit out 6 radical 3. And then the last thing I can do is I can reduce that because 6 is divisible by 2. So I get 3 plus or minus 3i radical 3. So there's my 3 answers. 1 is here, x equals 6, and then this is technically 2 answers because there's the plus case and the minus case. So I have a total of 3 answers, which is perfect because that was my degree. Now, there was another way to do this. There were 2 formulas. So if you went back to the very beginning and you said, well, I know my a is my coefficient in front of my x, so 1, and I know b is going to be the cubed root of 2/16, which is 6, then you could plug into the 2 formulas. For difference of cubes, it would have been x equals b over a, and x equals negative b plus or minus bi radical 3 over 2a. So you could also plug a equals 1 and b equals 6 into those equations, but I think most of you actually preferred going through and doing the quadratic formula here. Okay, so we have one more problem where we have to deal with x to the 4th. I'm going to go ahead and set up my parentheses. And remember we said x to the 4th just splits into x squared and x squared. Not a big deal. But I need factors of 64 that will get me negative 20. And you know what? I just realized that this is the same as the problem we did 2 times ago. It's just that problem you had to move the 64 over, and in this problem, it's already done like that for you. So we've already been here. We've already done this. So please just reference 2 questions ago for this problem. Okay, so here we go. We're getting into some synthetic. We have to divide here. So I am going to set up, I'm going to use my coefficients. If I look, I did not skip any x's, so I do not need any zeros. Bring down 2, negative 3, 4, negative 3, In my box, because it is x plus 2 that I'm dividing by, I will put negative 2. And then we are going to begin. So my 2 comes down, 2 times negative 2, negative 4. Negative 3 minus 4 is going to be negative 7. Negative 7 times negative 2 is a positive 14. 4 plus 14 is 18. And 18 times negative 2 gets me negative 36. And negative 3 minus 36 gets me a negative 39. So that's my remainder. But because it just said to divide, I need to say what the quotient is, including my x's. So remember, if your degree starts out as 3, when you put your x's back in, you need to drop your degree by 1. So I'm going to start with x squared, then x. So my answer is 2x squared minus 7x plus 18, remainder, negative 39. So here's another synthetic problem that we're going to do. If you look, you haven't skipped any x's, so you can just bring your coefficients straight down. We're dividing by negative 2 because this says plus 2. I bring down my negative 5 times negative 2 is 10. Here I get 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. This gives me 3 times negative 2 gives me negative 6 and 0. Okay, so now my remainder is 0. And I started with a degree of 3, so I add them back in, starting with x squared. So that was a very similar problem to the last one that we did, except this time our remainder happened to be 0. So now I'm asked to use synthetic division to find p of negative 3. Now remember, p of negative 3 means plug it in. Give them exactly what they want. When you put it in the box, you're going to put the number negative 3 in that box. You're not going to switch the sign. Now if you look at this polynomial, I go from x to the 4th to x to the 3rd to x. I totally skipped x squared. So I have to put a 0 in that spot. So my coefficients are going to be 1, 4, 0, negative 6, negative 6. My 1 comes down, I'm going to get going. So 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. 4 minus 3 is 1. Negative 3, negative 3, 9, 3, negative 9. I get negative 15 as my remainder. Now remember, p of negative 3, you're only interested in the remainder. So that's your answer. You're already done. Okay, last problem. So here, instead of giving us a polynomial that we need to graph, they've given us the same thing. It's just we have it in factored form already. So it's really easy to find our zeros. X equals 0, x equals 2, and x equals 4. So I'm going to plot those points here. And then I need to go back and I need to figure out my end behavior. Now, the problem is I don't know my lead coefficient or my degree because it's already in factored form. So we have to work backwards. We are going to take our x minus 2 and our x minus 4, and we are going to double distribute. So when I do that, I get x squared minus 4x minus 2x plus 8. Combine these, I get x squared minus 6x plus 8. But that whole thing still has to be multiplied by this x out front. So I get x cubed minus 6x squared plus 8x. Now I can look at my end behavior. My lead coefficient is 1, which is positive, which tells me right up. My degree is 3, which is odd, so I need to go left down because I need to do the opposite of whatever my right side was doing. So my right side, I'm going to go up. My left side, I'm going to go down. My multiplicities are all 1 on my equation, so I just kind of connect my dots like that with this little swoopy thing in the middle. All right, so that's it. Please make sure you study this. Go back and look through the questions again, see which ones you need to watch my explanation on again, and I will see you in class for your test.